Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a stack of really intense source material. We've got articles, commentaries, historical analyses.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. It's all focused on the Apostle Paul and his extraordinary and you could say uncompromising anger. Specifically, we're trying to figure out what was so foundational that it provoked him to invoke a divine curse.
Yeah. And we're heading straight into the epistle to the Galatians for this, which is where Paul's tone just shifts radically.
It really does. Our sources all confirm he is more aggressive, more forceful, and frankly, angrier here than maybe anywhere else in his writings.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to really move past that surface-level disagreement and unpack a critical distinction Paul was making.
Okay.
We need to understand the difference between, say, problems of Christian immaturity, which he handles with instruction and discipline, and problems of fundamental theological distortion.
Right. What was actually at stake in Galatia that was so severe, so much worse than even the moral chaos he was dealing with somewhere like Corinth?
That's the question.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we need to start by setting the stage in Galatia.
Definitely.
The sources detail the background of this letter with real care. Paul had established these churches during his first missionary journey.
And it wasn't easy work.
No, not at all. The sources note he invested incredible emotional energy. It says the establishment of these communities was achieved through great effort and, significantly, tears.
He really saw them as his own children in the faith. He'd nurtured them.
Exactly. And that personal investment, I think, makes the crisis that followed all the more dramatic.
It does, because soon after Paul left, this group arrives. History calls them the Judaizers.
And what was their message?
They introduced something Paul instantly recognized as fundamentally corrosive. He actually called it a different gospel.
A different gospel.
And what this different gospel demanded was, well, it taught that salvation required Gentile converts to adhere to Jewish conditions.
So things like circumcision.
Crucially, mandatory circumcision and the strict keeping of the law of Moses. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was presented as necessary for full acceptance by God.
So it's basically saying Christ is necessary, but not sufficient. You also need this whole checklist of Jewish law.
Precisely. And to enforce this, the Judaizers launched a two-pronged attack. First, they attacked the theology.
And
Second, they launched a direct personal assault on Paul's credibility. They tried to undermine his authority by claiming he was not a true apostle, suggesting his message wasn't as valid as the Jerusalem apostle.
And this is where the tone of the letter immediately shifts into the red zone.
Yeah.
I mean, the analysis points out that Paul is instantly extremely indignant.
Oh, completely.
He just skips all the usual opening pleasantries, wishing them health, thanking God for them like you see in Romans or Corinthians.
None of that.
Instead, he launches straight into this forceful defense of his own apostleship, and then, boom, right into a harsh proclamation of truth. There's no gentle buildup at all.
It's an extremely rare stylistic choice for him. It signals immediate, almost existential danger. The brief mention of grace and peace is followed straight away by a theological artillery barrage.
Which brings us right to the core conflict, the root of this incredible fury. We have to clarify what was really driving him.
Right.
Because Paul's anger was not ultimately motivated by the personal attack, the questioning of his authority, even though he defends his apostleship fiercely.
The deeper what he saw as the unforgivable wound was the theological breach, the distortion of the very essence of the gospel.
They were trying to replace the gospel of grace,
which is founded entirely on God's unconditional love, and they were replacing it with conditional legalism. The substitution of grace for works, this requirement that you have to earn God's acceptance, that's what Paul saw as fundamentally destructive.
And this is where Paul's own background becomes so critically important, as the sources all highlight.
Exactly. Paul had been the perfect legalist. I mean, he spent his life successfully adhering to every single requirement of the law.
He knew that system inside and out.
He understood firsthand the power and the spiritual danger of trying to justify yourself through performance. So for him, his rejection of that conditional framework now, his conversion to Christ, was absolute.
So now he sees it as a false gospel.
A false gospel that actively destroys the grace of Christ, which is offered freely.
And this leads to the shocking declaration that really defines this whole letter in our deep dive today.
Paul states that anyone preaching a gospel other than the gospel of the cross, the gospel of unconditional grace, even if it were himself, or, shockingly, an angel from heaven, should be accursed. The sources cite Galatians 1.8 directly, and that word is key.
Wait, let's stop there. We really do need to clarify that term, accursed or anathema.
Yeah.
What did Paul actually mean by using such extreme language?
Well, the sources are clear. Anathema doesn't just mean a strong rejection. It means a complete, irrevocable separation from God.
Wow.
It's the strongest possible declaration of spiritual condemnation you could make. Paul is essentially declaring theological total war.
He's saying the consequence for twisting God's love, for making it conditional,
Is spiritual death. This shows that for Paul, this issue was, quite literally, a matter of heaven and hell.
So he's saying that if he himself came back later and changed his mind, he should be rejected. That's an astonishing statement.
It's an uncompromising defense of the gospel's integrity. He's placing the truth of the message above his own ego, his own reputation, even his future self. Which leads us to a crucial question the sources address. Was the situation in Galatia really that much worse than in other churches he founded? That is a necessary comparison to make. If Paul used the most severe language possible here, where does this put the Galatian believers compared to, others?
Right. And the sources give us this powerful essential contrast to help us understand the severity that the Corinthian church. Oh, right. The Corinthians.
Yeah. If you look at 1 and 2 Corinthians, that church was a mess.
That's putting it mildly.
Their problems were severe. Pervasive immorality, including an instance of incest. Internal divisions that led to them suing each other in court. Drunkenness during communion, envy, boasting, pride. It was a church full of intractable issues.
And yet, when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he rebuked them, he chastised them severely, called them children, argued with them. But he never reached the point of invoking this irrevocable curse, this anathema against them.
And this difference in treatment is the single most important insight we can pull from the source analysis.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Corinth's problems were issues of immaturity and flawed conduct. They were living scandalously, yes, but they hadn't fundamentally changed the nature or the root of the gospel itself.
So they still believed the right thing, they were just living the wrong way.
Basically, they still accepted salvation as unconditional love and grace. They were just failing miserably at living up to the ethical demands of that love.
I have to push back here a little, though. I mean, incest and drunkenness seem objectively worse from a moral standpoint than worrying about whether or not you're circumcised. Why does Paul treat the theological error in Galatia as a far greater threat?
That is the exact question the sources address, and the answer is that the Galatians weren't just struggling with conduct, they were attacking the very root.
The foundation.
The fundamental principle of unconditional love and grace by introducing a conditional, law-based gospel. To Paul, if you change the root, the entire tree dies. If you require works for acceptance, you destroy grace.
So one is bad fruit, the other is poisoning the soil.
That's a great way to put it. Corinth's failures were against the expression of the gospel. Galatia's failure was an attack on the existence of the gospel. Paul believed that if the foundation of grace is destroyed, all those ethical failures in Corinth will follow inevitably.
Why is that?
Because all attempts at righteousness will just be corrupted by pride, fear, and performance anxiety. So this attack on the foundation justified his extreme, uncompromising defense. Defending unconditional love meant cursing the conditional message that sought to destroy it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, then, Paul's shark cry of anathema shows us exactly where the true battle lines were drawn in the earliest days of the church.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that, the foundational significance of this whole confrontation. The source material argues that it is deeply meaningful that this specific conflict, this total war between conditional love and unconditional love, was recorded and dealt with so violently right at the beginning of the New Testament era.
It establishes the central conflict forever.
And this understanding also has huge implications for the cross itself, right?
It does. The sources assert that the crucifixion was, in its essence, conditional legalism, represented by the mindset of the religious authorities.
Crucifying unconditional love, which is Christ.
Exactly. This framework shows that the battle Paul was fighting in Galatians wasn't some new theological argument. It was the exact same ideological battle that put Jesus on the cross in the first place.
So the Judaizers were trying to drag the new faith back into the very system that killed its founder.
That's what Paul saw, yes. So the crucial takeaway for you, the listener, is this. The source material argues powerfully that the first button of the gospel has to be fastened onto the cross of God's unconditional love. This unconditional love, or agape, It is the heart of the new covenant. It is completely non-negotiable.
And that is what Paul was protecting with such intensity, a zeal so great it led to his sharp cry of anathema against anyone who would dare compromise grace with human effort.
Hmm.
But what does this all mean? Our deep dive into the sources really illustrates that Paul's extreme, uncompromising anger wasn't a personal grievance. It wasn't about his reputation or popularity.
No, it was a measured response.
A measured response to how high the stakes were. His uncompromising rage protected the very foundation of grace against conditional performance. It established that the nature of the gospel mattered infinitely more than the church member's struggles with daily conduct.
He was willing to risk sounding harsh to save the core message.
Which raises a really important question for reflection.
It does. Given that Paul saw those promoting conditional requirements for God's love as being under a curse, how often do we, today, find ourselves subtly drifting toward defining God's love or acceptance based on our own conditions, our performance, or checklists?
That's a tough question.
It forces us to examine whether we truly rely on unconditional, non-performance-based love, or whether we have, maybe unknowingly, reintroduced the Galatian problem right back into our own spiritual lives.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We look forward to exploring the next stack of information with you.